Hello, everyone. We're back. Welcome back to our second session of the day. We have a really stimulating panel coming up. Adam set us off really beautifully with his opening remarks about data. And actually, it's one of the things we care about in our Guggenheim Symposium, in fact, all of our programs, is how important data is, not only to good reporting, but to good understanding of what the situations in the various fields of criminal justice reform are. Traditionally, we usually have what we call a crime trends panel, looking at both what's been happening over the past year in terms of crime statistics, and also trying to project a little bit ahead, at least over the next year. And to take us there, we're really pleased to have Blumstein of the Carnegie Mellon University, Richard Rosenfeld of the University of Missouri St. Louis, and Cynthia Miller-Idriss of the American University to take us into another area, which of course is really front and center this year, which is the salience of extremism, particularly right-wing extremism and violence. So let me start very quickly with Professor Blumstein. Al, the floor is yours.
By the way, okay. If I could go to the second slide.
Okay, we'll share the screen just right away. Chris, are you on?
Focus on trends in crime and punishment. What I want to do is focus on some history, where we are, how we got here. The impact of COVID in 2000 will make many things change. National data, unfortunately, is still very limited, and the FBI's Uniform Crime Report for 2019 didn't come out until December of 2000. And the FBI is developing some interesting, important new formats with incident-based crime statistics, which will be much more informative in the future. But since the federal data isn't out, we're going to be hearing some excellent reports on local data from individual cities that Rick Rosenfeld will do next, but I want to do some of the background. I'm going to start with some of the trends in punishment and look at incarceration over the past century. And so can we get, and I'm going to follow that with some background on crime trends. Can we get the next slide, which is the graph of US incarceration from almost for the whole century, from 25 to 19. Most of you have seen the right-hand side of that graph, the impressive growth in incarceration rate. That started in the early 70s. I want to start with going back into the 20s. And a major thrust of that is the impressive stability of punishment that characterized that first half of the century from the 20s to the 70s. Go to the next slide, which is the graph of that period. 25 to 73, the annual rate was 110 per 100,000 population. It's impressively stable. It even gave rise to a paper that I did with Jacqueline Cohen entitled A Theory of the Stability of Punishment that was published in 73. Just about the time that the rest of the system was going to prove me wrong by starting the right half of that graph, of that previous graph, the rapid rise during the 80s and 90s. A feature of that time was that the policies were under the control of the criminal justice system. What we've seen since then is an important politicization of the control of criminal justice policy And when they were under the control of the system, when prisons got full, they could let some people out earlier. They could do parole release. When prisons had slack, they could crack down on minor crimes like pornography, prostitution, other kinds of effects. And there were some fluctuations you see in the incarceration rate graph. So there was a rise during the Depression when there might have been more crime involved. And there was a slack during World War II when the nation had more use for the men than locking them away in prison. We go to the next slide. I want to come back to the second half century and the prison population that was the case then. If we could go to the next slide, which is a graph of the incarceration rate from 25 to 2019, clearly a different scenario, triggered initially by the concern over drugs. The public called on the political system to do something about the drug problem, and particularly they didn't want their kids caught up in drugs. And the political system didn't particularly know what to do, but they hit on sentencing. And the public is rather naive about the effects of sentencing, but the political solution seems to have worked. They ended up previously on drug offenses, people were sent to probation or other effects dealing with drug problems. But it worked politically, not necessarily effectively. Incarceration, they realized, was not a very effective means of control for the drug problem, because as soon as you lock someone away, the drug market is out there and it will recruit somebody to replace them. And the problem was that the rise of incarceration occurred in the 80s and 90s, but it didn't do much about dealing with the drug problems. And one of the areas in which the effort was particularly intense was cracking down on crack. Crack was marketed by Blacks in open air markets, in contrast to cocaine, which was marketed in behind closed doors where they would check anybody coming in. So there's a lot more violence, partly as a means of dealing with the competition between the drug dealers or attacks for drugs. So drug dealers had to be armed. One of the consequences of the cracking down on the drug dealers was the replacements were predominantly coming out of the juvenile population. And it turned out, for example, that there were no Black juveniles involved, no increase in Black juveniles involved in the drug markets until about 1985, after they've gotten rid of a good number of the adults that were in it. And juveniles were far less restrained in their use of guns. And so we saw a significant rise in homicide and gun crimes by juveniles. That was on the rise, and significant growth in the violence associated with that. As the rise started, the candidate factors contributing to the rise could have been more crime. It could have been more arrests per crime. It could have been more commitments per arrest. It could have been more time served. So that's the issue that will be of considerable concern. And it turns out, if we go to the slide that says the rise, which I think is the next slide, all the rise was from commitments per arrest and time served. Interestingly and rather surprisingly, the more crime and the more arrests per crime were not major contributors. It was essentially out of the courts and prisons and parole system that was contributing to that. There was a transition in crime that occurred about 1993. But in 94, the famous Truth in Sentencing Act, known during the recent campaign as the 94 Crime Bill, was passed in part because the continued rise in homicide was a major continuing concern. But the UCR report of 94 crime, which was down, didn't come off until late 95. The rise in incarceration tapered off in about 2000 and was pretty flat after 2000, with a peak at about 506, 5 times the previous rate of 110, almost 5 times. And it was pretty flat after that. And indeed, the next graph, the US incarceration rate from 2000 to 2019, shows you how flat it was. The rate is in blue, the trend line is in red, and the trend line here was coming down somewhat. It sure looks like a stability of punishment was being set in. And again, I'm sure that 2020, with all the release of prisoners, both at the state and federal level because of concern about contagion, had a significant drop, but there was a concern that this might be a new normal. And it was a rise to the peak of 508, and that was a flat peak in 2007 and 8. And then past that peak, there was this decline of about 1.5% per year. There have been many calls to cut the incarceration rate in half, and that would mean cutting a recent 440 down to 220, and that would still be double the 110 rate of the 1920s to the 1970s, and well above the rate of 75 to 150 of almost all developed countries. So even if we doubled the annual rate, which was 1.5% per year, that would take 23 years to get down to the 440. Let me turn to the next slide, which is the murder and robbery rates from 60 to 2019. The murder is understandably shown in red. The robbery rates are shown in green, again, understandably. And leave that graph on because I want to make a few comments about it. The trends of murder and robbery are strikingly close to each other, have been. The early 60s, that rapid rise was reminiscent of the 64 election where Barry Goldwater blamed Lyndon Johnson for the growth of crime in the streets. But really, that was a demographic shift. The baby boomers, the people born between 46 at the end of World War II until about 64. We're moving into the high crime ages, starting at 16 to 18 and 20 peak. And so that was when the crime was, those crimes were going up. The drug war got heavy in the late 70s, the early 80s. The major aspect of the enforcement was on crack, as I said, marketed by blacks outdoors. And crack was associated with violence because of it all going out in the community. Congress even passed the Drug Crime Control Act in '86 that said a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence for 5 grams of crack and 500 grams of cocaine, whether that was a racial intent or whether that was because of the violence associated with crack markets. Both are clear possibilities. And again, the replacements were juveniles. Let me say something briefly about the murder-robbery rise after 1980. The rates rose to a peak in the early 90s, and the demand for crack then declined because the world got to know how much impact crack had on people. And so the demand went down, and we saw that impressive drop from about 93 to 2000, that impressive drop of 45%, documented by a book that Joel Wallman of Guggenheim and I did called The Crime Drop in America. It was a collection of papers, and 2 of the papers attributed some of the growth to the growth in prison population at the time, but only 25% of it. After 2000, as you will see, after 2000, after the drop, crime rate was fairly steady or declining. Very little growth until you see that slight growth in homicide, but not in robbery in the last few years until 2019. And you're going to hear a lot more about the very strange and impressive growth of homicide in 2000, but we won't see that in the uniform crime reports until 2021. That's for starters. There will be room for comments and suggestions later. So let me turn over to Rick Rosenfeld, who is next.
Okay, so Professor Rosenfeld has done some really amazing work over the last year in discussing the reasons for that rise in homicide, whether it's illusory, fictional, short-lived, or whatever, and also on the impact of COVID on homicides itself. So I'm going to turn it over to Professor Rosenfeld, and you have a slide presentation as well.
I do. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Al. Good morning, everyone. As soon as the first slide comes up, I'll begin. I'll say by way of introduction that the work I've done on recent crime changes during the year 2020 has been supported by the Council on Criminal Justice, and our most recent study, which I'm going to focus on this morning, was also supported by Arnold Ventures. And as soon as the slides appear, I'll begin.
Steve, I don't have the slides.
Oh, Richard, were you going to put them on, or do you want me to put them on?
Oh, yeah. I thought you were going to put them on, Steve. I sent them to you.
Oh, it's easier if you can put them on so you can control them. But you know.
Ah, okay. Sorry about that.
We have them if you can't find them.
Okay, and then I'm not sure how I share them, Steve.
All right, I'm going to do that.
Okay.
Sorry, Rich, I thought that you would put them on for a minute. Here we go. You see them on your screen?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Okay, let's go to the first slide. The one after, yeah, that's great. So let me summarize the report we did for Arnold Ventures and the Council on Criminal Justice that looks at year-end crime changes for last year, the year 2020. I want to give you a brief summary of the overall picture across 10 different crime types, and then I'll focus on what happened with homicide. So we had 34 cities in our sample. As Al mentioned, we were not able to use the so-called official crime statistics produced in the Uniform Crime Reports by the FBI because they simply weren't available. I should say the FBI did make available, finally, one might say, quarterly and then semi-annual crime statistics for the year 2020. And that was for the first time since the 1930s that the FBI had produced quarterly reports. But those reports didn't cover the entire year. And so we, like other researchers, had to go to local police department websites. And in some cases, we contacted local crime analysts in the departments by phone to obtain the data. The 34 cities are by and large cities, and I'm reasonably confident they're roughly representative of all cities in the US with 250,000 population or more. We saw, as Al mentioned, a major homicide increase in 2020. Of the 34 cities for which we had data, 29 had increases. Most of those were double-digit percentage increases over 2019. On average, homicides were up 30% in 2020 for that city sample compared to the previous year. And that amounted to nearly 1,300 more deaths due to homicide in those 34 cities in 2020 compared to the year before. There's a contrasting picture, though, for property and drug crime rates. With the exception of motor vehicle theft, property crimes were down. Home burglaries were down by nearly a quarter. Larcenies were down 16%. Drug offenses were down 30%. And in this case, in my view, it's reasonably certain that those declines were connected to pandemic-related restrictions, population restrictions that kept more people at home, and therefore residential burglary went down. Yeah, Steve, could you go to the full screen? That'll make this image a little bit bigger for people.
The next slide.
No, just if you can go to full screen on this this presentation, I'm sorry, go to the slideshow option. You see up at the top, it's just to the right, slideshow. It goes home, insert, design, transitions, animation, slideshow, right up at the top menu there.
Let me see if I can get it on. I've got something blocking it. Hang on.
Slideshow.
Design.
Transition, animation, then slideshow. Just click on that.
Yep.
Click on slideshow and then go from current slide. Great.
There you go.
Excellent. when more people are at home burglaries go down because burglars tend to avoid occupied households. When the shops are closed, larcenies go down because there's no shoplifting. When there are many fewer people on the street level drug exchanges decline. Also during this year, as the police had been doing during previous years, the police were simply prioritizing away from enforcing low-level drug offenses. I'll talk more about the policy challenge, but the policy challenge certainly has to involve three elements in my view: subduing the pandemic, improving confidence in the police, and then implementing or improving evidence-based anti-violence strategies. Okay, next slide, please. Let's now focus a bit on homicide. Here is the monthly homicide rate for those 34 cities between January of 2017 through December of 2020, last year. And the pink shaded area is the area of during which the pandemic related restrictions were in place. Although, as everyone knows, they were eased at various points during that period up until the present. And that vertical red line is a so-called structural break in the series. What it indicates is a statistically significant difference between in this case, monthly homicide rate that came before that line and then the rate afterwards. Okay, so what do we see here? We see a homicide rate that is generally speaking within a relatively wide range, fluctuating in a more or less stable manner through the first 2 years, certainly, and into the third year. What we then see is a major rise in homicide that begins at the beginning of the pandemic period, although much of that rise is simply the rise we would have expected anyway, given seasonal changes, until we get to that vertical red line, that structural break. And that occurs in June of 2020. And a salient event was the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis at the very end of May, and the emergence of widespread mass protests against police violence that occurred almost immediately thereafter and persisted in many places through much of the summer. I'll return to that, the correspondence between the homicide rise and the emergence of mass protest in just a moment. After the peak that occurs in July 2020, we do see a drop-off in homicide, though up until the very, very recent period, we don't see a decline that completely erases the homicide increase that we experienced last year. Now, before we go on, let me point out and make a connection to Al Blumstein's presentation. Al noted that very large, 45% decline in homicide and other serious crime from the early 90s through the present. That major crime decline has not been erased or eliminated by the recent increase in homicide. For example, in our 34 cities, in 1995, they averaged a little over 19 homicides per 100,000 population. Even with the big rise last year, the average was about 11 per 100,000. So the Great American Crime Decline, as it's been called, has not been erased, was not erased by this still very troubling rise in homicide we saw last year. Next slide, please. Ooh, this one doesn't come out quite like I wanted it to. No problem. What I've done here is simply arrayed the 34 cities and the percentage change. There should be horizontal bars here, but they didn't come through. No problem. That red vertical line indicates no change. Everything to the right of the red vertical line indicates that the city saw an increase in its homicide rate from 2019 to last year, and everything to the left of that red vertical line indicates the city saw a decline. Well, the first takeaway is that all but a few cities saw increases, and if you look at those percentage increases, they are in most cases quite sizable, double-digit percentage increases or more. If you start at the top of the list of cities, the first couple of cities are relatively small with very small homicide counts. So even though Chula Vista and Chandler had 150% or 133% increases, those are increases, percentage increases over a very small base. But as we move down the list, we get to cities with larger homicide base, that is a larger number of homicides. And in the case of Milwaukee, there was an 85% increase from 19 to 20. In the case of Seattle, a 63% increase. Chicago, 55% increase. Memphis, 48%. New York, 43%. St. Louis, 35%, and so on. So these large percentage increases are certainly not limited to small cities with small numbers of homicides. Next, please. Okay, just a quick look at the other side of the coin. That is to say, what was happening to property and drug offenses. And here's the home burglary chart. We see the structural break occurring actually a month or two before pandemic-related restrictions were imposed, and then a big drop to a fluctuating plateau during the pandemic period. If we could go to the next slide. Here are the larceny rates. The structural break or significant change occurs right at the beginning of the imposition of pandemic-related restrictions, including the closing of businesses. We see a drop and then a rise, something of a rise during the remainder of the pandemic period, presumably as a result of businesses beginning to reopen. Next, please. Here's the monthly drug offense picture. We see a big drop beginning at the beginning of the pandemic period with some fluctuation along the way. I would point out, though, that drug offenses were beginning to drop as early as the beginning of 2019. What we're seeing here is a continuation of that trend, but even more so. In other words, even greater rate of decline in drug offenses during the pandemic period. Let me also point out that while we're using the term drug offenses, in the main, these are drug arrests. That's how the police typically find out about an offense, not because someone calls them up, although that does happen, but because they make an arrest and record the offense based on that arrest. Next, please. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the very troubling increase in homicide and, I should say, other serious violent crime. What needs to be done in addition to subduing the pandemic so that the police and other community actors can return on a full-time basis to engage in the activities that the evidence shows can reduce crime, even while the pandemic remains an important element. It's important to begin engaging now in two basic approaches. One is police reform, in my view, and the second is to implement or expand the proven strategies we know can reduce crime. With respect to police reform, I would ask that we put chatter about defunding the police or abolishing the police to the side. My view is that those are mainly rhetorical devices, but that, and they should not be kind of confused with genuine, and I would argue constructive and necessary police reforms. One is quite obviously to increase accountability for serious police misconduct, obviously including unwarranted police violence. And the other, which we've heard something about, is to redirect activities that have fallen by and large on default to police departments, to other agencies that are better equipped to handle them. It's never been clear to me, for example, why the local police department is so often the first responder to drug overdose. Most of these calls do not involve serious criminal conduct other than the fact that the drug that beyond that, no serious criminal conduct, no serious violence. And the local fire department has been in the medical emergency business for decades now, much better positioned to respond to drug OD in most cases than the police department, which would free up the police to devote greater time and attention to their core mission, which in my view, especially now, has to be addressing serious violent and also property crime. Secondly, responding to the homeless and other troubled populations when those incidents, as is true in most cases, do not involve serious criminal conduct or violence, should be left to agencies whose personnel are far better trained in crisis intervention, dealing with persons' emotional problems, than are the police. Now, there's real room here, I think, for negotiation, even with police unions on both of these fronts, because rank and file police were the first to say, hey, we're not social workers. We're not adequately trained to respond to certain problems that have fallen by default on us. So I think there's real room for moving ahead on police reform. Secondly, we have to, even amidst the continuing pandemic and the restrictions it's imposed on policing, redouble efforts at so-called proactive policing, hotspots policing. That is the single most effective policing strategy to reduce crime. Perhaps the second most effective strategy, the research is now showing, is the so-called focused deterrent strategy, which calls on the police and other criminal justice actors and social service agencies to focus their attention on those relatively small number of individuals who are disproportionately likely to become the next violence offender, or for that matter, the next victim. And we need to, as soon as possible, restore, and then I would argue expand, effective social service interventions, one of which is hospital visits to gunshot victims. The research there suggests that those visits can reduce subsequent violence. They've been curtailed or greatly reduced, of course, during the pandemic when hospital visits themselves have been curtailed. So these two approaches, in my view, are interdependent. I don't think we're going to get communities that have had a traditionally difficult relationship with the police to embrace with open arms more proactive policing unless community police relations are improved. And that, it seems to me, depends very much on moving ahead with police reform. So that's my 2 cents for this morning. And thank you, Stephen, for slide mastering.
It's not quite mastering. Thank you, Richard. It's more than 2 cents, by the way. I think it's, the value is much higher than that. But let me, before I go to Professor Miller-Idriss, let me just ask both Richard and Al a quick question about what we think is driving the homicide increase and the separation the divergence between the property and larceny downward trend and the upward trend in homicides. We, as Daniel Wilhelm said earlier in the day, we ran a piece in the Crown Report and on the HFG website with Professor Butts of the John Jay, who talked about why the New York rate has spiked so dramatically.
Yeah.
And he was suggesting it's a question of social disruption during the pandemic, so he linked it to the pandemic. But I'm interested in both of your ideas of what you think drives it before we go over to Professor Miller-Idriss.
Very briefly, I do think the pandemic is involved in part in the rise we've seen in serious violence because of its impact, not only on the general population, increasing stress and strain, but also its impact on policing. When police officers are short-staffed because officers are out on quarantine, or when they're subject to social distancing requirements, that limits the kind of proactive policing that can help to reduce crime. But also, I would point out that the big uptick in homicide in most of the cities we looked at occurred immediately after the George Floyd killing in Minneapolis and was sustained, I would argue, by the Breonna Taylor killing in Louisville. So there's certainly a correspondence in time between the rise in homicide and the emergence of mass protests around police killings and the police killings themselves. What's the nature of that connection? It's been suggested two possibilities, Stephen. One is that as police officers were taken off their normal patrols out in the neighborhoods to address protest activity, typically in the center part of the city, that reduced policing of a sort that could help to keep violent crime in check. Also, we have to ask what's going on in communities, in particular communities with traditionally difficult relationships with the police during a period of mass protests against the police. And it's not unreasonable to suppose that those traditionally difficult relationships sour even further, causing people to be even less cooperative with the police when investigations need their cooperation, less likely to report crimes to the police, more likely to take matters into their own hands to solve problems, and that could have contributed to the increase.
Thanks, Richard. If Al is still there, if he wants to respond, I don't see Al in the gallery, but he may not be. Okay, let me move to Professor Miller-Idriss, but if you have questions, let me remind you to put them in the Q&A section below, and we will get to them, as many of them as we can before the panel ends. So it'll be hard this year not to talk about crime trends without discussing what has been on our minds over the last 6 months, and certainly since January 6th, is the rise of extremist violence, particularly on the far right. It's not a new phenomenon, as Professor Cynthia Miller-Idriss can tell us. But it certainly is something that's really occupied our minds. It was certainly mentioned in the first panel this morning. So what we hope is that Professor Miller-Idriss can take us a little bit further and deeper into what really are the things that we need to worry about. What's the truth about the salience of extremist violence? Should it be something we worry about? And perhaps more to the point for our audience, what's the best way of covering it? So Professor Miller-Idriss, welcome to our symposium, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you for having me. And I'm not going to share slides. I'm just going to cover 5 points. So I'll try to make sure to keep it to 2 minutes or so per point, so that we can get to Q&A. Since I know there will be questions. So the first thing I want to talk about is sort of how we got here, very briefly, which is that what we're seeing in the rise of the far-right fringe and fringe violence from far-right extremist individuals and groups over the past decade plus really started, what we had after Oklahoma City was a slight quieting of far-right extremist violence, followed by steady increases that were essentially overlooked while eyes were on Islamist terrorism post 9/11. And so what we did have was record-breaking numbers of hate groups after President Obama was elected, followed around the same time, 2008, 2009, by the creation of new kinds of anti-government militia groups that were steadily kind of growing and increasing Followed by a kind of mainstreaming and normalization characterized by what we saw in Charlottesville in youth culture, not only in the US, but globally, that started to create new ways of communicating online, spreading through memes, through youth culture, different kinds of spaces, online gaming chat rooms, a whole new level of recruitment and engagement, and a kind of weaponization of youth culture that positioned far-right youth culture in particular as a kind of edgy counterculture to the mainstream, which I can go into at some point. That led to, after Charlottesville, a number of prominent incidents, of course, of terrorist violence, which we're well aware of, in Pittsburgh and El Paso and Christchurch, that did then finally draw significant attention from the US through first a series of hearings and attempted legislation, and finally in October 2020, the new threat assessment from the Department of Homeland Security that declared domestic violent extremism and in general, and white supremacist extremism in particular, the most lethal and persistent threat facing the nation. So that new threat assessment did establish what I think had been clear for at least a few years, but was difficult to get kind of acknowledged. Then, of course, just a few weeks later, we see the start of the mobilization around the Stop the Steal campaign. And so leading into what happened on January 6th, which I'll talk about. But in the meantime, I want to put in the context globally, we have also seen a 250% increase in far-right terror globally. Both the numbers of attacks and the percentage of the lethality of attacks has increased over the years, so that by now we have, by 2019, far-right terror is responsible for 82% of terrorist deaths in the West. And just about half of incidents are in the United States and a little less than half of the deaths. So those are the Global Terrorism Index figures in their 2020 report. So the US is experiencing an outsized amount of this and is producing an outsized amount of it, but it's certainly not only exclusively limited to it, and the increases are happening globally. So we've seen, just in the last year, the assassination of a German politician, the attempted storming of the German parliament in August, in which several hundred militant extremists did get through the first police cordon and then were thwarted at the second line of police. We have seen the assassination of Joe Cox in the UK a few years ago, the plots against the Michigan and Virginia governors. So the rise of anti-government extremism happening along with the white supremacist extremism that we've been seeing in places like Pittsburgh and El Paso and Christchurch being very, very clear especially during the pandemic, but even before that. There's been, in 2020, a slight decrease in the numbers of deaths attributed to right-wing extremists. So it has dropped to something like 16, at least 16. But that's probably because the main means of death in the U.S. From terrorist events has been mass shootings, and during the pandemic conditions, there were not crowds. I mean, school shootings are also down. So we have seen a decline in that. However, we saw a near doubling in the amount of propaganda circulating on the white supremacist extremist side and record-breaking gun sales. So we know that there's still some sort of combinations of factors that create very high risk, along with extraordinarily high amounts of time being spent online. So increases in propaganda, and particularly for youth and those who are vulnerable, we know that there's high risk for what might be happening in terms of the radicalization side. In terms of what it's rooted in, my third point. So the first was how we got here. Second is the global nature. The third is what is it rooted in? I want to say what stitches this spectrum together. So the far right is really a spectrum. It includes the biggest two groups are the anti-government extremists and the white supremacist extremists. But we've also got incels and male supremacist violence. And we've got kind of single issue extremists like anti-abortion violent extremists. It's a combination, a sense of existential threat rooted in some kind of combination of anti-democratic beliefs, hierarchical ideologies about superiority and inferiority between groups, and that can be male supremacy or Christian supremacy or white supremacy or Western supremacy. So we see these Western chauvinist is the term that the Proud Boys uses to describe themselves, for example. There are conspiracies and fantasies about some sort of restoration to a utopian ideal. And finally, the use of violence, sometimes in what's called accelerationist ways, which is a belief in not just the necessity, but the desirability of using violence to collapse all systems and bring about an end times that will lead to a subsequent restoration, a rebirth, phoenix-like kind of rise from the ashes. In terms of vulnerability within the population, I could go on about that for a long time. I won't go into it in great depth, but I think what's important to note is that sometimes what I consider to be something called precariousness is often mischaracterized in the media and by scholars and policymakers as actual economic insecurity. And it's really important to note that doesn't bear out in the data. So being unemployed is not actually a risk factor, but having grown up with an unemployed parent is, for example. So it's a sense of precariousness, a fear that something could be taken away from you, that you might lose something, especially if it's framed as then being given to someone who doesn't deserve it. So I call that a kind of precariousness plus entitlement, something you think you deserve to have, whether that's a white majority country or Second Amendment rights that are going to be taken away by the Democrats or Obama or an election. And then manipulation through propaganda comes and frames that as something that you're losing, that will be taken away and given to someone who doesn't deserve it, even tyrannically, is a real mobilizing force. It converts to a sense of betrayal and anger and then easily mobilized into, in some cases, violence. What we have seen is that works, again, across the spectrum in many different ways, but it's consistent, a kind of consistent, so that what you had on January 6th, for example, was only about 9% of people being actually unemployed, but some 60% of those arrested, of the arrests so far, 60% of those arrested in the Washington Post data on this are people who have experienced some kind of bankruptcy or eviction or tax lien or something that gives them, even sometimes going back decades, into childhood. So again, that sense, there is a sense of economic precarity, but it's not actual disenfranchisement, not actual unemployed or the lowest rung on the ladder. And I think that that's an important distinction. The second kind of miscorrection, this is my fourth point, is that it's not just groups. In fact, it's not even predominantly groups. And there's an outsized attention, I think, both in the media and among policymakers, and certainly in the congressional hearings going on this week, to the role that groups play, like the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys. But globally, I will say that most far-right terror doesn't come from groups. Only about 13%, 13.4% of the terrorist attacks since 2002 that have resulted in at least one death come from or attributed to a specific group. That's consistent as well with what we saw on January 6th, which is about 15% of those arrested so far are linked to specific groups. And so the vast majority of terrorist violence comes from individuals who are not affiliated or not card-carrying members of groups. That makes it much more difficult on the law enforcement side, of course, to track and to infiltrate. Now, some of the reason why that violence, terrorist violence, like in Christchurch and El Paso and Pittsburgh and elsewhere, have come from individuals who are not members of groups is because the predominant law enforcement strategy on the FBI has been to infiltrate, one of the predominant strategies to infiltrate and use sources within to break up plots, which they've done successfully. So there were at least 35 domestic violent extremist plots that the FBI broke up and law enforcement broke up in 2019. So groups do matter. They are plotting things. Those plots get broken up often because they can be infiltrated. And groups are, of course, responsible for recruiting and spreading propaganda that then radicalizes individuals. But the vast majority of the violence is then committed by people who are not members of those groups. So there's a kind of paradox there that makes it difficult to think about how do you go about intervening it. What I would argue here is that it means that we need a different tact in addition to the kind of securitized and law enforcement response to far-right extremism that we have been seeing and that we typically see. We also need more investments in the roots of radicalization and trying to understand how to create better things like media literacy, to recognize scapegoating, to recognize online manipulation, to understand what disinformation looks like, what misinformation looks like. Both for sort of fifth graders and 50-year-olds. So, I run a research lab that's testing those kinds of interventions, and I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. And the last thing I want to just say is, the scale of response right now to post January 6th, after 9/11, we got, among other things, an entire new agency, the Department of Homeland Security, which is sort of focused on risk and security. And I think we have to be thinking about that scale of response on the intervention side as well. I'm thinking about what does prevention look like, because the securitized kind of solution to this is so difficult with the groups. And we have to think more about how we interrupt self-radicalizing networks online, both through kind of working with social media and tech companies, but especially through building resilience to reducing some of the vulnerabilities and the susceptibilities to those propaganda, disinformation, and misinformation techniques. And the good news on that is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. 3 months after Germany's storming of the parliament, there was a massive reaction. I mean, that had been building obviously for some time from the government. They invested €1 billion in 89 specific measures, which do, of course, also reinforce a lot of law enforcement and security needs, but have a lot of investment in research, in interventions, and in civil society organization approaches. We've seen similar kinds of things from Norway and Christchurch after their terrible terrorist incidents in 2011 and in 2019. And I think it's clearly an area where we need a lot of global kind of cooperation and discussion in order to better understand how best to respond. So I will stop there. Yeah.
Thank you, Cynthia. So we have a lot of questions in our Q&A section, but let me start with a quick question to you. I mean, we've been hearing this rhetoric for years, arguably decades, but now we've seen the violence coming out from as a result of the rhetoric. What do you think is the triggering factor that turns rhetoric into violence? I mean, you know, I don't want to get into politics here, but obviously the first conclusion people have drawn is that, you know, when politicians encourage this sort of thing, it makes violence acceptable. But we've seen that happen not just in January 6th, but, you know, in what happened in Michigan and other places, when people actually take their rhetoric seriously and actually try to do something about it. But do we know anything about the factors that start this going and how you stop it?
Well, we do know, I mean, so political rhetoric does matter. There's good research on that from Kurt Braddock about the connection between political rhetoric and violence. There are other folks working on it, but I think, you know, so when you have politicians who either are perceived to be legitimizing or even calling out groups in ways that are received so by groups as a legitimation, when you have a kind of normalization of anti-immigrant rhetoric, as we've seen in many places around the globe, a kind of nationalist rhetoric and even a dehumanizing rhetoric in some cases by referring, you know, that is a kind of not just populist, but a nationalist or a dehumanizing rhetoric that happens about other peoples across the globe, that doesn't help, right? It certainly doesn't help. And we know that it contributes to that normalization and mainstreaming. But the mobilization to violence, I think, is, first of all, nobody really understands what leads across all the years of research that we have on terrorism, no one really understands what leads one person who's an ideological believer to move toward violence and not another. So I think we have to understand that there's no perfect formula here. You can't really predict with precision which person who is radicalized is going to move toward terrorist violence. But we do know that there are a mix of factors there that play into this, both on the vulnerabilities side, which are kind of the drivers, things like that precariousness and entitlement. Also, isolation plays a role, a lack of belonging, a sense that they want to be. I mean, most of these people, you saw this very much on January 6th, very fervently believe that they are the courageous revolutionary actors who are acting heroically to save democracy. And so, you know, or to save their people. I mean, so there's a lot of rhetoric in the propaganda about being a savior, being a hero, a warrior, a soldier. That's one of the reasons why law enforcement, veterans, and active military are being recruited heavily by some of the militia groups, and why they are vulnerable to it in some cases, because they are also attracted to some of that rhetoric. And so we see, you know, when you have a lack of belonging, that's why the pandemic conditions have also been such a hotspot of vulnerability for the conspiracy theories, as well as some of the other far-right militia movements. When you have a lack of belonging, isolation, a lack of sense of purpose or meaning, and you have propaganda and groups reaching out and recruiting, promising that here's the way to behave heroically. We know that a lot of middle-aged moms have been susceptible in ways we never expected to QAnon. And then it has led to kidnappings and, violent and to criminal activities that they believe they're saving children from a pedophile ring, and so they're radicalized in part because they believe they're able to do something. And I think there's a lot psychologically to unpack there as well.
Okay, thank you, Cynthia. Let me, there are a number of follow-up questions for that I want to ask, but let me move to some of our questioners first and go back to Professor Rosenfeld and Blumstein. There's a question from Kate Holland, who asks about for Professor Rosenfeld in particular, what are the demographics of victims and perpetrators during the 2020 rise in homicides? Do we know anything about that? Richard?
We don't know much, Steve, because as Al and I pointed out, we won't have that information that we need to make nationwide assessments of demographic characteristics of victims and offenders until later this year, when the FBI finally produces the 2020 official crime statistics. Having said that, there is evidence from several cities, including my own city of St. Louis, that suggests that the increases in violence that we're seeing are occurring in the population groups and in the communities where a serious violent crime has traditionally been very high. So in St. Louis, but Chicago and New York, as Jeff Butts pointed out in the interview that you reproduced, the neighborhoods that have traditionally had high levels of violence were the very neighborhoods in which we see the big increases. In St. Louis, half of the homicide increase between 2019 and 2020 occurred in just 6 neighborhoods, and they tended to be disadvantaged communities of color with very high levels of violent crime. So what we do know suggests that there's no big shift in the demographics of victims, offenders, or communities so far, as we've been able to determine from the relatively small number of cases for which we have the information.
Okay, thank you. One more question again for Professor Rosenfeld before we go to some questions for Professor Miller-Idriss. This is from Tom McMorrow, who I'll read it as he says, is that you point out that police drug stats are based on arrests and that those numbers would seem to indicate a decrease in drug use until recently during the pandemic. McMorrow asked whether this drop in arrests is caused possibly by intentional police disengagement in reaction to the protests after the George Floyd killing. This is a recurring theme, and it's probably worthwhile to ask that question again.
The answer to the second part of the question is no. That is to say, it's not the drop in drug arrests began occurring prior to the emergence of mass protests in late May and early June of last year. Drug arrests had been going down at least for the previous 12 months, and in many places they'd been going down starting even earlier. And the decrease in drug arrests is led by a decrease in marijuana arrests. And so I don't think it's a function of the police being demoralized and giving up on drug arrests so much as it is just a general policy shift away from enforcing relatively low-level, especially drug possession statutes.
What about the simple fact that police are more overworked now because so many of them have been booked sick during the pandemic? I mean, if there's
fair enough
out there.
Fair enough. I think that's an important factor. And the question sort of raises this issue of what is often called de-policing, that is police being less fully engaged in their jobs. And one interpretation of de-policing is that it's demoralization. The police are angered, frustrated, and they're just simply pulling back. That may be the case in certain instances, but a far more important impact on so-called depolicing is the pandemic and pandemic-related restrictions, which reduces staffing and because of social distancing on the street, reduces the kind of police community contact that can help to reduce crime.
I'm going to save some of the other policing questions for tomorrow when we're really going to dig deeply, I think, really deep dive into policing issues. But I've got a couple of questions here for Professor Miller-Idriss on right-wing extremism. The first from Rebecca Tan from the Washington Post, who asks you to describe the role that prominent white supremacist groups from the 19th and 20th century play in today's far-right extremism, and what are the ways to understand or contextualize far-right groups that reject legacies like the KKK. I'm not exactly sure what she's referring to there, but perhaps you know. And then
I think I kind of know. Hi, Rebecca.
And from April Kelly, if I can just add it, you might want
yeah,
to
sure.
How much does Christian nationalism play a role in the radicalization of far-right extremists?
So good questions. On the historical legacy, I mean, the KKK, had these three waves of historical surge kind of in the US, and the most recent one around the civil rights era coincided with the emergence of the patriot militia, the kind of anti-government extremists in the 1970s. So that there was a kind of growth around the same time. And I would say the KKK has, that ideology, at least the white supremacist ideology combined with the vigilantism does continue to kind of play a role and is in the context of kind of a backlash of civil rights is the way I see part of that kind of increase at that time. I think what's really changed, of course, is the aesthetics, obviously. So I think that there's the Charlottesville khakis and polo shirts compared to the guys in Ku Klux Klan hoods. The Charlottesville aesthetics are much more a reflection of what you see in the modern youth-driven kind of far-right extremist movement. A lot of coding, a lot of youth culture around memes, the iconography of T-shirts that send messages, right? There's just a whole different kind of world of how it works instead of this kind of cloak and, in the dark of night lighting a cross on fire. So, I think when it comes to groups who are denying that they are white supremacist, which is the way I interpret your question, I think that's where this hierarchy, it's important to understand these different kinds of hierarchies of superiority and inferiority. So you have groups that are male supremacist and Western supremacist that disavow race as a hierarchy, say we're not white supremacists, but that those hierarchies of supremacy, of superiority and inferiority are still there. So you have anti-Muslim groups, you have, anti-immigrant groups that will still then, potentially even have members of color in them, right? And so that it can confuse people, but I think if you understand it as a spectrum that includes different kinds of hierarchies about superiority and inferiority, instead of only linked to one form of that, which is the predominant form in the US historically as white supremacy, and also the majority of these groups and individuals, but not the only form. And that's where you get kind of the incel violence, the male supremacist violence, the Western chauvinist violence, and the Christian nationalism playing in. So I would just roll that into that question, which is that it plays a role. It does play a big role, and there are folks who work on this exclusively that I can point you to, but it's, I see it as one of many different forms of supremacy that animate the movements. And there's a little bit of a kind of choose your own adventure, not to be too, cavalier about it, but different elements of it that come clear. And then the last thing is that sometimes the crimes or the description of the crime that's charged, in the case, for example, of Timothy McVeigh, which is widely considered to be an anti-government extremist attack because that was his motivation, but he was also a known white supremacist. So it's just that his justification for what he did was anti-government, attacking a government building, not explicitly white supremacist. So there's often a lot of mixing of these kinds of things, even when things aren't explicitly stated as the reason for a terrorist or violent act. I think it gets quite messy quite quickly when you start to unpack it.
Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I did want to make some time to pose a question to Professor Blumstein. But before we do that, there are two good questions I think left for you, Professor Idriss, I'd like you to tackle. The first one from Eddie Burkhalter, the Alabama political reporter, who says, asks us, what do you see journalists doing wrong when reporting on extremism? And I suppose by implication, what could we do right? And related to that, a question from Marshall McLeod, who asks, what interventions are possible about the terror involvement of those people who aren't associated with the groups but would like to be part of it? And she's particularly interested to know what role law enforcement would play. So that's sort of a two-part question. If you can answer it quickly, and then we'll move on.
Quickly, yes, I'll do quick responses. So on the journalists, yes, journalists, I feel like the biggest mistake that happens in the media is the platforming of extremists themselves. It's an ongoing problem, and I think there is an attempt among a lot of journalists to try to tell the perspective or tell the story that we know has led to recruitment by those same groups. And so I think you have to be very careful about platforming people who are members of extremist groups. And what journalists are getting right, I think, is digging into not just simple explanations, but really getting into this distinction between economic insecurity and precariousness. For example, I think when that gets treated well, there's this level of sophistication that we're seeing in the media that I think we weren't seeing for some time, and that's great. On the interventions, I'll just say quickly that it's extremely difficult, and there's very thin evidence about how disengagement and de-radicalization can be initiated. So I think it's much better to be talking about prevention and very early interventions and off-ramping. And I can go into that at greater length another time, but just to say that in terms of law enforcement, that means places like the PAL, the police action leagues, the community-based engagement between law enforcement and communities is the place where that kind of level of prevention and intervention can take place, where we're thinking about what are the ways to partner on media literacy or in helping people understand source integrity, helping kids understand what predators look like and what grooming looks like. And that's, not just on the side of sexual predators, but also extremist propaganda, and putting it in that context as a preventative measure. And law enforcement's done a great job on that on the predator side for sexual exploitation. And I think could take much the same approach with young people in particular on recognizing that online manipulation takes a lot of different forms.
Thank you. Al, I want to give the closing words to you. If you can unmute yourself. We were asking earlier, I don't know if you were here when you heard the question about what seems to be driving the various factors. And I'd like you, particularly the increase in homicides. And I wonder if you could project a little bit over into the next 6 to 12 months and sort of think about, or tell us a little bit about where you think we're going over the next year. I mean, we know the pandemic eventually will leave us, assuming everybody gets vaccinated, but that's one of the factors that's going to drive or influence the homicide rate to a certain extent. But where do you see us going in the next year or so? If you can unmute yourself, Al, and then you can. Could you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
That's an intriguing question, and one would anticipate some of the aspects of the empty streets and the domestic violence that are associated with the pandemic might well change and come back to the situation that we had in the earlier 2000s. And I would anticipate that the crime drop will continue as roughly flat and declining somewhat, because since 2000 we have seen a rather steady decline, a fairly stable incarceration. Now, lots of people have been let out. We have a wonderful opportunity to compare recidivism rates of the people who've been let out in different settings and to get a much better reading as we look across the states of what recidivism rates are as a function of age, as a function of time incarcerated, as a function of treatments. So we have a wonderful opportunity that I hope we pursue, but it's awful tough to really forecast what aspects of crime will return as the crime rates have come down. And we still don't know why the major homicide increase that Rick talked about contributed, other than that, look, hey, these very large double-digit increases aren't necessarily any higher than they were in the 90s. So it's awful tough to know just what's going to come back and what police enforcement is going to look like, to what extent drugs, which has been a major driver, is going to continue to be a driver in police activity. So it's a very tough one in terms of making a forecast for 2022.
Well, at least that's a good point to, that's a good thought point to leave on. I wish we had a little bit more time, but we're going to have to close now. But I want to thank everyone, Professor Rosenfeld, Professor Blumstein, Professor Miller-Idriss, for leading us up to the point. I think there's a lot more we can talk about. We will post the slide presentations on our website, so you can look at them in your leisure. And we're going to take a half-hour lunch break. If we were in normal times and normal campus, I would invite you all to join us at the campus for a delightful meal, but it will now have to be virtual. So I wish you the best in wherever you are, and having a nutritious repast and a rest. And we'll see you back here at 12:30. Thanks all.
Thank you all. Bye.